Thank you very much. And similar to our practice over the last few meetings, we will record this segment and then we will post this information on the COVID-19 website for Pine Richland. This provides sort of a 2-for-1. We have a narrated what is a podcast, and that way for those who want to stay informed of what is happening, they're able to view each of those and get accurate, clear information. So again, just like last week, I'll start by saying thank you to the board. This is 4 consecutive meetings, and those meetings allow us to grow, learn, understand differently, and then make recommendations for return to school. Without this kind of flexibility and commitment from the board, and the investment of time and energy in understanding the topics of discussion, we would not be able to lead and govern in the same manner. And so I do want to, on behalf of the district, all the district, those that know and don't know, say thank you to the board. My component tonight will be a little bit shorter, but there are some significant updates that I want to draw your attention to. So Sean, next slide. As people become engaged, and one of the things we know is that people engage at different times and for different reasons. So as the hybrid model was developed, we had some level of engagement. Tonight, we have athletics and activities. We see a different level of engagement in terms of understanding, what's in the presentation. And so sometimes when people engage later in the process, they may miss some of the story. And so on this slide, the very first bullet is beginning back to July 31st, we have a posted podcast from that hybrid model. Then almost 1 per week, if not more, of narrated podcasts exists. And so anyone watching or listening who wants to understand where have we been, where are we now, and how is our thinking and planning evolving, I would recommend they go back to July 31st. It would be a wonderful afternoon invested in listening and thinking because, frankly, it takes humility to be a part of an iterative process. It takes humility to understand that new guidance, new learning, new understandings occur. And as we understand that, it shifts our thinking as we move forward. So the other items were the same from last week. Next, Sean. Okay, same concept. But at this point, I want to talk about patience and flexibility. So when we mention patience and flexibility, every head begins nodding. Living patience is a totally different story. And so before we finish this, I'm going to have Dr. Justice just mention a little bit about the K-6 virtual only component of our model, just because it's one element of a pretty complex model, and we need patience as we continue to work through some of those details. So again, these 3 things are really important. Change is constant, patience and flexibility are critical, and stay apprised of details and information. Next slide, Sean. Again, key point here is we cannot be surprised by shifts between hybrid and virtual for all if needed. In a little bit, Dr. Pasquinelli and Mr. Simmons will talk about the athletics and activity plan. And the same thing is important. It isn't just how something starts. It's understanding that at this time, in 2020, there may be starts and stops and pauses and other things happening all over the educational programming. So that's important to understand. Next slide, Sean. Okay, again, the hybrid model is the current plan, and as we'll see in the next slide when we look at the measures update, as we are now 1 week basically till the first student day, we see conditions, which is one part of our measures and metrics, support hybrid learning model. So that's where we are, and that's where we'll be starting the year based upon those lagging measures that reflect conditions. Next slide, Sean. All right, so again, this is some of the key concepts of what we're monitoring. So if you look at the date or the title, you see 8/21/20. Every Friday, the state updates this COVID-19 early warning monitoring dashboard. So if we start on the left side, those measures are used to determine, those thresholds, what level of community transmission exists. And we can see that when it comes to positivity, we're below 5 right now. But when it comes to incident rate per 100,000, we're between 10 and less than 100. And so based on the language of this framework, moderate is either or. And so since we're between 10 and less than 100, we are in a moderate transmission area. So when we look on the right, we see, as we talked about, a 2-week look back. The most recent week for incident rates is 38.0 for Allegheny County, and for positivity, 3.9. So as we have followed these measures over the last few meetings, we've seen them slightly declining, but in a favorable way for the hybrid model for learning. So that's good news. We want to continue to see that. The experts at Allegheny County Health Department do say that as the city and as the region opens up, so we have tons of students returning to colleges and universities and schools and all sorts of things happening, they would not be surprised to see that flatten or maybe even increase a little bit, just based on the degree of socialization happening in different ways. So again, we haven't seen that yet, but remember that incidence rates are a lagging indicator. So it takes some time in order to see what's happening there. But right now, good news relative to those two measures, strong support for the hybrid approach to learning, and that's what we are planning to do beginning next Tuesday. Next slide, Sean. Okay, and again, we've talked about this last week. This has to do with the number of confirmed cases that exist within a school or schools or the district. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide in the context of our hybrid model. And so, and I also think this has relevance for the next discussion, which is around athletics and activities. Next slide. Okay. So last week we talked about this, but I want to emphasize a different point. So on the right side of the screen, we see the difference between quarantine and isolation. Healthy people are quarantined when they are deemed close contacts of a confirmed case. Healthy people are quarantined when they're deemed close contacts of someone who is a confirmed case. And the purpose of quarantine, and quarantine is directed by the health department. Now, people could choose to do that, but otherwise it's directed by the Allegheny County Health Department based upon exposure or being a close contact to somebody who's a confirmed case. Isolation is the person who's sick. And so isolation means no contact with others for a period of time, 10 days plus or minus, and you have to be a certain number of days symptom free. So again, not all people who are confirmed positive with COVID-19 require hospitalization or other supports, but isolation is for somebody who's sick. One of the points that I wanted to make this week on this slide is in the middle. It says PRSD model and the big three. And the first sub-bullet is that not all hybrids are the same. Pine-Richland hybrid is built with the understanding that asymptomatic students and staff will walk into our schools. We've not said it exactly like that before, but we need to understand it because it's the very basis for how we designed our hybrid. So why do we have only half of the alphabet coming to school? Why are we doing different things at different levels? We're doing those things in order to provide the 6 feet of physical distancing between students within the school setting and staff, so that when asymptomatic students or staff come into the building in a mask, hand sanitizing, in facilities that are being sanitized, keeping physical distancing, when that happens, if someone becomes confirmed positive down the line or days later, or someone shows symptoms, we, when we're working with Allegheny County, have the confidence to be able to report and say that This is our hybrid. These are the measures that are in place. Our setting in the schools, and later we're going to hear about it in athletics and activities, when it's within our control, it can be highly regulated. You see what happens when it's not within our control. You see it when you drive down the street, you see it in communities, you see it on TV, you see it everywhere. And so we can do a lot of things within our programs, whether that's the hybrid model during the day, or as you're going to hear about in athletics and activities, we can do a whole lot to put in place regulations and restrictions and protocols. But as we have talked about many times, next slide, Sean. Next one. It's an ecosystem. And so behavior outside of a regulated environment impacts things that happen within it. So we've really done a lot of thinking around every aspect of what we and other school districts are charged to do. I mean, I can't begin to tell you my level of appreciation for the sacrifice of the board, administrators, health professionals, all those who provide insight to what we're doing, how we're doing it, and what our plans are. But if we cannot understand this, then we are going to have a challenge in implementation. And so later tonight, when we get into, or the next item, when Mike and Sean talk a little bit about our recommendations for athletics and activities, you know, there's going to be some things in our recommendation that those who want to play will like to hear. There are some things in our recommendations that we're proposing as non-negotiables. Things people may not like to hear. Because what we're trying to do is discern what is a reasonable course of action as we reopen and attempt to normalize and socialize and do the things that are a part of the fall of 2020. And so it sort of goes both ways. That commitment by us, by our staff, to making recommendations happens because we live and breathe this job. We live and breathe the responsibility. So when I look outside and I see students who are not in a mask, hugely bothersome to me. It's a requirement when students return to school unless they have a specific reason not to be in it. When I look and I see a lack of 6 feet of physical distancing, when it would be easy to do so, that's a problem. And so these are things that are going to have impact. So when we make a recommendation around a continued phase-in for sports and activities and other things, the behaviors that we see that are not demonstrating the big three are going to undermine attempts to be able to consider that. And so there are consequences. This is life. Life, there are decisions and consequences. And so how those work together, my hope, our hope, is that when considered together, there will be incentive for students to not only do the right thing when it's required, but to be able to demonstrate that discipline when no one's watching in order to increase the likelihood of success. But again, these are learning opportunities for everybody. But again, I'll go back to a comment I made at the beginning. Next slide, Sean, although I think that's it. Yeah, that's fine. I'll speak for myself. There's humility in learning. Every time we talk to our healthcare professionals on our leadership council, they talk about the learning that's happening in this field with COVID-19 and the need to continue to understand what's going on. So I mentioned earlier that when it comes to patients, we need some of that, not just the head nod when people hear we need to be patients, but the actual patience that comes with implementing complex things. And Kristen's going to mention just a little bit about the K-6 virtual-only model with the dedicated teacher.
Yeah, so just as a reminder, we have our K-6 model virtually with a dedicated teacher, and that had been established based upon responsiveness and listening through those iterations of improvement to each of our plans that we had developed initially. So being able to offer that and to give context to it, we also developed a podcast to share kind of the outline of what it would look like in terms of the virtual learning, and it mirrors, because of the dedicated teacher at the K-6 levels, the ability that we would have to instruct kids if everyone were virtual. So that communication had gone out previously, but to shed more light on that and to answer some questions that families had, we also sent a communication this evening to the families of the 100% virtual model, sharing even specific grade level schedules that had not been shared previously as samples. So we had seen grade spans and some kind of loose ideas of what it would look like, but that context has been shared. And one thing we're excited about within that is that we are still individualizing the learning for the students. So you'll see built into that RAM time and places for the interventions to occur that would typically happen within the school setting. So all of those types of small group opportunities are occurring to meet the students' needs. And so between now and the beginning of school, we're continuing to look at all that work strategically, and we're offering professional development specifically this week to the teachers today and tomorrow. They're enhancing their own competencies around the instructional approaches that they'll take in the classroom. And then they have time beyond that for the majority of the week outside of Rams Way training, essentially, to practice those and to work with colleagues. And we've been seeing new grade level teams formed, extremely creative ideas coming from the teachers already, and even the principal, Ms. Guerin, in terms of how they're going to connect and build community within that setting. So as we've been discussing, patience and flexibility are of utmost importance. We're going to continue to work through the model and look at what we can do to continuously improve as we work through the days ahead and even into the beginning of the year. So to the families who are receiving that communication tonight, hopefully that assists in helping paint the picture of what it'll look like a little bit better, and there will be more information to come.
Thank you. So that's part one. Mr. Stovener, if you could pull up the next presentation, please.